Good morning, everyone. 6:30, we're going to go ahead and get started. Just making sure could be heard online as well. All right, so today for Grand Rounds, we have Dr. Hirose. Dr. Hirose came from, he went to Columbia University for medical school before going to UCSF for both residency and his fellowship in transplant surgery. He was then hired on as faculty at UCSF and made his way up the ranks as professor. Prior to joining us at UW at the end of 2023 as chief of our division of transplant surgery. He has served as chair of multiple committees at the American Society of Transplant Surgeons, the American Association of Study for Liver Disease, and UNOS, and is currently the surgical director of the Scientific Registry of Transplant Recipients. He has many research awards and manuscripts in the field of transplantation and is here to share his expertise with us on the current state of solid organ transplantation in the United States. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Hirose for our Surgery Grand Round presentation this morning.
All right, well, thank you so much, Glenn. All right, well, thank you so much for inviting me to give Grand Rounds, and thanks for your fortitude of showing up at 6:30 in the morning and what appears to be the start of our cold and rainy season. It takes a little more motivation to get up out of bed when it's pitch black out, but I thank you for being here and thank all the people online for listening to me for the next 45 minutes or so, or an hour. I really want to go over the current state of solid organ transplantation in the United States. If you read just the newspapers, you may think that we are in an utter chaos and that the organ transplant system in the United States is broken. I'm here to give you a little better news than that. And I'm going to base my talk on data and not hyperbole or exaggeration or anecdote or really a false narrative of what may be going on in the United States in organ transplantation. So I hope by the end of this talk, you'll be convinced that we are actually okay, but we definitely have headwinds. I've been here for all of 2 years as of November, and I thank Dr. Wood and others for welcoming me here. I have no financial disclosures. I do serve as a surgical director of the SRTR. Who knows how long that's going to be around, and I may get to that at some point. But right now, we are the registry that reports and analyzes and transparently gives to the public and all stakeholders the state of U.S. transplantation. And that is, we report on outcomes of every single transplant program in the country, as well as every single organ procurement organization. It's a HRSA contract, and what I say today are just representing my personal views. So I do not represent the SRTR, and certainly I do not represent the views of HRSA or the Department of HHS at this point. All right, so by the end of this, hopefully 45 minutes or so, that one in the audience will understand the historical context of solid organ transplantation. We'll be able to describe some of the interesting technical innovations that change the way we actually perform transplant surgery, appreciate some of the ethical quandaries we face in transplantation, and understand some of the controversies that are circulating in the community and faced by the transplant community. So a very brief history. Transplant surgery is a relatively young field. In fact, the first successful transplant we ever did was in 1954, and it is a high visibility field. People love to talk about transplant. It is an also extremely highly regulated field. I would say it's one of the most highly regulated fields in all of medicine. It's scrutinized. Data collection is not only voluntary, but is absolutely required of all transplant centers if you want to participate in the transplant system. There's a federal mandate for it. If you don't submit the data, you can't be part of the system. The data then are distributed freely and in a very transparent fashion. So any member of the public, should be a researcher, et cetera, can get their hands on the data that we collect. So it is freely open. Both the OPTN and SRTR provide those data. Those data are also used to monitor very closely all the transplant hospitals and organ procurement organizations. Transplant can be ethically charged. I would say we sometimes violate some of the norms of ethics and medical ethics, including do no harm in the case of living donors. And it is so medically complex. Everyone says they're a team sport, and they all are, but we are an extremely team-dependent field, and I'll get to that at the end. So again, a very brief history of solid organ transplant. The first successful human organ transplant everyone probably knows was done at the Peter Ben Brigham Hospital done in December 23, just a few days before Christmas in 1954. Dr. Joe Murray recounts how near Christmas he was listening to his radio on his way in to do this famous operation. He was eventually awarded the Nobel Prize. It was interestingly a living donor transplant, not a deceased donor transplant. And the living donor transplant worked. Why? Because they had identical twins as their first donor recipient. So Ronald and Richard Herrick. Ronald donated his kidney to Richard, who had end-stage kidney failure. And interestingly, that transplant kidney functioned for 8 years. So this was a significant milestone in the field of transplant, but it's also only an immunologic curiosity, to be honest, because they did not face the genetic barriers of doing transplant. So very few patients with end-stage renal disease, end-stage liver disease, end-stage heart disease have an identical twin. And obviously you can't do living donor transplants in heart, except maybe for a domino transplant. But in any event, the next big thing that happened was the advent of modern immunosuppression. So instead of just a curiosity, intellectual curiosity that you can do when you have an identical twin, we actually ushered in the era of modern transplantation with the advent of cyclosporin. And cyclosporin was a revolutionary drug. We went from just steroids and azathioprine, which weren't really great drugs, and total body irradiation and other things we did to people to try to get people to accept their organs. In the 1970s, I was told, because I wasn't doing transplant at the time, you booked your transplant nephrectomy at the same time you booked your transplant, because there was more than half the time you're going to leave the hospital without your kidney transplant. Cyclosporin took that 50% survival at best to 90% survival. And so this ushered in the modern era of transplantation. Now, how did our U.S. transplant system evolve? Well, one of the key things that happened was a piece of legislation called the National Organ Transplant Act. And this was written in 1984, and it was actually a bipartisan thing that was successful, something we don't see very much these days. This established two things, the OPTN, or the Organ Procurement Transplant Network, and the SRTR. It authorized the Department of HHS to establish and implement oversight of organ procurement organizations, and also NOTA made it illegal or a crime to sell human organs, to exchange organs for transplant for valuable consideration. Interestingly enough, I would be remiss not to mention one of the founders of the ASTS, Oscar Salvatierra. He was the chief of the UCSF transplant service from 1974 to 1999. He was absolutely instrumental in passing the National Organ Transplant Act, and his story really is inspiring because it took such perseverance and persistence to get this thing across the finish line. In fact, Al Gore, one of the sponsors with Orrin Hatch, said Dr. Salvatierra was a driving force behind the passage and enforcement of NOTA, showing single-minded determination to overcome circumstances that would have dissuaded most others. He encountered serious opposition. The AMA didn't want this to happen. The Reagan administration didn't want this to happen. But in battle after battle, Dr. Salvatierra refused to be turned aside from his goal. As each new difficulty arose, he faced it with courage and determination. He stands above all others as individuals most responsible for bringing groups together to pass NOTA, which has made life better for thousands of transplant patients and their family nationwide. In the New England Journal, the opinion piece, of course, said that the House of Delegates, James Davis, delivered testimony that strongly opposed federal intervention of this kind of practice. They stated that it would authorize cookbook approach to medical practice with chapter and verse written by the Secretary of HHS, etc. And of course, Salvatierra and two other physicians testified on behalf of ASTS, offering conflicting views. Here's a letter that Oscar wrote to President Reagan, to the White House, because this legislation was stuck in committee. So the House had passed a version, the Senate had passed a version, and it was stuck in committee. If it didn't get out of committee into Ronald Reagan's signature, then it would not pass. And note, it was written in September of that year. At the end of that year, a new Congress would come in, and then they'd have to start all over. This was a very polite letter that the White House wrote back several days later. Thank you. Our position on this legislation has not changed. We continue to oppose the bill. This is from Ronald Reagan. So this doesn't look too good. But he persisted, and the long and short of it is they passed this thing. You can see the date. And this is a note from Al Gore. Dear Oscar, we couldn't have done it without your help. he was not only persistent, but he got across the finish line, and that's what has dictated the U.S. transplant system for a long time. So what did NOTA do? When it established the OPTN, which is the Organ Procurement Transplant Network, and it said it's the national system to assure equitable distribution and maximize utilization of organs. It also established regional organ procurement organizations throughout the U.S. Before, there were no such thing as an organized system to get organs donated and procured, and also established the National Scientific Transplant Registry, or the SRTR. So what were the OPTN tasks according to NOTA? It was to facilitate matching of deceased donor organs and recipients, have a computerized system and a 24/7 organ center, to develop consistent base policies and procedures for transplantation, provide professional public education about donation, facilitate deceased donor organ recovery, distribution, collect and manage data regarding organ donation and transplant, and provide data to the public, the government, researchers, all stakeholders, and to the SRTR to help guide continuous improvement efforts. So this was all legislated, right? So there was no evil monopoly that OPTN or UNOS, which was the first contractor and held it for many years. It was designed to be a quote unquote monopoly where an entity would control these things and thus be able to coordinate the different aspects of the transplant system. UNOS, we have a former president of UNOS here. I participated in UNOS for many years. It has held the OPTN contract, and actually, in a way, it still does, even though they say that they're going to break it up. That's who runs the U.S. transplant system right now, today. So it was ordered in 1986 and had continuously held it until HRSA sort of said, we're going to do away with this single contractor. I'm going to break it up. It operated on the auspices of HRSA, which is obviously the Department of HHS. And OPTN policies were written using evidence-based rules and regulations regarding organ transplantation and controlled how organs were distributed and allocated. Again, as time went on, the final rule, which is another piece of not legislation, but regulations, which carry the weight of federal law, was fully implemented in 2001. This was signed by Donna Shalala, who was Secretary of HHS at the time. And it was delayed because pockets of the transplant community actually opposed the final rule. And so they said, well, let's get the IOM to do a study. They published their findings, which pretty much agreed with the final rule. And then it was finally implemented. Again, it's implemented in March of 2000, carries the weight of federal law, et cetera. And actually, one of the things that the final rule does, it sets the policies for the equitable allocation of cadaveric organs among potential recipients. Specifically, they say that allocation policy should be based on sound medical judgment, avoid futile transplants, achieve the best use of donated organs, designed to avoid wasting organs for both patient access and the efficient management of organ placement, shall not be based on the candidate's place of residency or listing, except to the extent required by the above, and organs should be distributed as broad a geographic area as possible. This is all written in the final rule. We're supposed to follow this. This has been a hard thing to accomplish. Again, the HHS rule was opposed by some transplant professionals, but the OPTN has followed the same sort of policy and procedures to create policy. And so the main things are they gather ideas, they develop proposals, it goes out for public comment, comes back, it gets revised, and then when it gets implemented, it is then studied. And we want to see what the effects, the intended effects, and the unintended consequences of changing policy. When we make organ allocation policy, and again, Dave and I spent over a decade changing the liver transplant distribution policy. We finally got it across after more than a decade of work. It's based on thinking about balancing competing events or competing interests that include fairness and equity, utility and efficacy, efficiency, logistic, and cost. Sometimes these interests are actually opposed to each other. So we have to balance some of these things and really think about how to create a system that has both fairness and equity and doesn't bankrupt the system. All right. So in terms of these principles, fairness and justice, what does that mean in transplantation? It means equity and access to organ patients with similar degrees of illness and urgency. And obviously, we want to try to give this access regardless of what race you are, what gender preferences, geographically. What about efficiency and logistics? We want to make sure that the organ offers get out efficiently so that you actually place these organs. We want to make sure that acceptances are recorded in a very fair fashion. Procurements, distribution, transportation, they all have to be coordinated. Maximize utility and benefits. We want to direct the organs not only to the most in need, but don't give organs to people who are going to just die right after transplant. All right, how were organs distributed at first? They were done with these crazy DSAs, which were never designed to be used in organ distribution. This was how the OPOs were assigned what hospitals they were responsible for getting organs to be donated, but it was used for distribution. And if you look, this map doesn't make any sense. Look at the OPO that Washington sits in, and look how tiny some of these other OPOs are, including in the Northeast. So the number of patients, the population, number of donors, the geographic area they were so wide and wildly different that it resulted in a lot of inequity in the system. If you look at the crazy map of Texas OPOs or DSAs, you can see how this hodgepodge of almost gerrymandered things would have bizarre placements of organs. So the DSAs were known not to be a great way to distribute organs, but neither was the UNOS region. So once it left the DSA, it went to UNOS regions. Again, these regions make no sense. New York State has Region 9. So if there's a very sick patient in New Jersey right across the river from Columbia University, that patient would never hear about an organ until Region 9 was exhausted of their patients. So someone could be dying right across the river and they could use that organ in Region 9 when they lived in Region 2. Same with Region 1. And those sort of artificial borders led to the notion that we actually wanted to get rid of DSAs, and we finally did. So now, currently, organ distribution allocation is now no longer dependent on DSAs or UNOS regions. In fact, the Hearst administrator at the time directed the OPTN to eliminate these. And so now, in general, they're allocated to hospitals with a certain distance away from a donor hospital, usually in concentric circles. So heart, lung, used to be the LAS score, now is a composite score, liver MELD score, and kidneys allocated with a 250 nautical mile circle. So no one is using DSAs and regions to distribute organs anymore. What about the rest of the U.S. transplant system? Well, this is just a subway map of how complex the U.S. transplant system is. That central light blue line is the journey that a transplant patient has to take to get to the point where they actually get a transplant and get followed. So if you look, someone with end-stage organ failure has to get referred, and that means someone has to tell them the transplant might be an option. Then they have to get evaluated. Then they have to get listed. Then you have to think about whether there's a living donor available. And then they get put on the list somewhere. They may die while waiting on the list or become too sick. They may survive the wait list. They may get an organ offer. That organ offer needs to be accepted by a center or a surgeon. Then they could undergo a deceased donor transplant if they're on the wait list. Then they have to recover. Then they have to survive. And they may lose their graft at some point. But long-term survival, long-term quality of life is the goal. To get that goal, there's so many things that have to interact. If you have a living donor, they have to undergo their workup, referring physicians, OPOs, etc. Now, in this complex system, how do you actually assess what the real current state of transplant is? The media would have us believe that the U.S. transplant system is in disarray and is irreparably broken. The reality is, and this is the reality, I'll show you the data that says this, the U.S. system of transplant is clearly the best in the world. No question about it. It sets the example. Let's go over some actual data. All right, so what is the current state? As of yesterday, there were this many patients waiting for an organ transplant in the United States. So most of them are kidney transplant recipients. So 93,000 patients are waiting for a kidney transplant, but that's just a cross-section. How many were added in 2024? We added 49,000 plus patients to the wait list. How many transplants did we perform in 2024? 27,760. That's not very good. That means that the list will probably grow unless they die on the wait list. You can see the last column is how many patients died that year. That is, how many were removed from the wait list for death or being too sick. In liver transplant, we have about 9,000 patients waiting, but we added 15,000 to the list that year. We did 11,000 transplants in the United States. So again, a deficit. The list is probably going to grow, but we do lose about 2,000 patients a year on the wait list. Lung and heart are not so dire, but they still probably need more organs. Heart transplant added 5,900 patients to the list and transplanted 4,500. Lung transplant closer to how many you add and how many you subtract. and you can see how many waitlist removals there were for death. Lung transplant has the smallest waitlist, but again, the list is a very dynamic thing. There's lots of ins and outs going in. So how do you measure how transplant is doing at all? This is a list of metrics that we have thought about and think about. And so some actually are better metrics of the entire performance of the system, and some may be better at measuring performance of specific transplant centers, specific OPOs. So things like transplant rates for listed patients and deceased donor yield and overall survival from listing may be good ways to figure out how the transplant system is working. Whereas things like your offer acceptance rate ratio, which is dependent on your centers accepting the organs, or patient and graft survival, or active versus inactive patients on the list, or even wait list mortality rate ratios, which is a rate that's risk adjusted, may be better ways to measure how a transplant center is doing. The UNOS MPSC or the OPTN-CSC has chosen to use different metrics to measure program performance. They used to really be focused on just one-year graft patient survival. They've switched their attention to at least consider the pre-transplant ratios, which include offer acceptance rate ratios and waitlist mortality rate ratios. Now, how is the U.S. doing globally? Well, there's not a huge global registry except for one that counts the number of donors and recipients there are in each country in the world. And if you look, these are the numbers of, the larger the circle, the number of kidneys from deceased donors you have. Now, Spain is always touted as the best system in the entire world in terms of donors. So if you look, where is the United States? Well, we're actually not that far behind from Spain. And if you look at the differences between Spain and us, they use older donors, they use more DCDs. This is the number of brain dead donors. And you can see that actually the United States is ahead of Spain in terms of donors per million. Again, donors per million population is not the best metrics. It is the best metric we have. This is the DCD donation rate in terms of donors per million population. And Spain does have an advantage in the DCD realm. One thing about Spain, though, and any other country, is that they don't publish their results. There's no transparency in their outcomes. I have no idea how many successful transplants they do. They do a lot of transplants. They use a lot of older organs. I have no idea what their one-year patient and graft survival is. All right, this is just a map of where the highest rates of deceased donor donation is in the United States and in Spain as the darker colors. Again, the transplant system is dependent on an organ procurement system, which also has multiple folks weighing in on things, including the donor hospitals themselves, which have to have a referral pattern that's really timely, et cetera. The donor families or the donor themselves have to give either first person assent or the donor family actually has to have authorization. And then there are regulators that look into rating OPOs and sometimes decertifying them. But what's actually happened in the United States as of late? This is a time scale. If you look at the deceased donor counts, deceased donors in the United States grew 45.4% between 2019 and 2024. How has this growth occurred? The growth has mostly been on DCD donors, that is donation after cardiac death. Brain dead donors did grow from 2019 to 24, but you'll see a slight downtrend, and I'll explain that in just a second. But the number of DCD donor growth has been explosive. Now, in terms of the kind of deceased donor deaths that we see, if you look at deceased donor counts and the percentage change of drug overdose deaths, it probably means that we are getting over the hump or the peak of the opioid epidemic. Some of these donors came from fentanyl overdoses. Many of them were DCDs. So the counts actually for both peaked in third quarter 2023. These are the deceased donor counts according to mode of death. You can see that that light blue line is, again, drug intoxication, but the yellow and green lines is from cardiovascular death and strokes, intracranial hemorrhage stroke. So again, we mentioned that the drug intoxication donors count peaked in Q3 2024, but the other causes have gone up. One of the things that have been criticized both in the literature and among us is that, God, we're throwing away a lot of organs, aren't we? We're not using it 20 to 25% of the kidneys, for example. And they say, oh, the rate of non-use of organs is continually going up. Is this true? And if so, why? So we wanted to try to diagnose why we're having an increased use of non-use of organs in the United States. there is probably a likely component of discard of non-use that could be improved by improving efficiency of placement, transport, and logistics. But the bulk of the reason probably remains is that the quality of the donor organs have gone down over time. And let me show you how that is the case. If you look at the non-use rate of different organs, you can see that kidney has gone up 29%, liver 12% less of a problem, lung less of a problem, heart utilization or non-use. Most of the organs are not actually procured before their decline. So non-use has to do with organs that are recovered in intention for transplant, those that are not. But kidney leads the way. Now, why is that? Here's the difference in the KDRI over time. That is the quality of the kidneys that we are recovering for transplant. If you look, that light blue line are the worst of the kidneys. They have 2 to 5 times the risk of graft failure if you use one of these organs. So the quality of the organs that are being recovered for transplant is getting worse and worse. That's no surprise given the aging of our population, the obesity epidemic, diabetes. So you can see why that the kind of kidneys that we're recovering for transplant is getting worse and worse in this country. So if you look at the adjusted non-use rate that is stratified by KDRI, in fact, it's pretty flat. So that non-use of the worst kidneys, that rate is actually pretty much the same. It's just that our kidneys have gotten worse. So that may mean that the non-use of these kidneys just is good clinical judgment. Be careful about what you read and why you think something is happening, because people have you believe that the system is in chaos. I suggest that we are being a little bit shrewd in which of the kidneys we put in, because putting in a kidney that never works is never good for a patient. All right. Now, what's a different metric? We think about what the best metric of looking at the health of the system. One of them that we're proposing is how many transplants do you perform for every single patient you die on the wait list? So that ratio is transplant per wait list mortality. And if you look over time, we're actually doing better and better at doing more transplants compared to the number of patients that die on the wait list. This is kidney. This is how many transplants for wait list mortality we're doing on liver. So more and more transplants compared to the number of patients waiting for a transplant, dying. Heart transplant, same thing. Lung transplant. So overall, I would say the health of the U.S. transplant system, although it definitely can be improved, is improving over time. Now, a lot of things can contribute to this. So we've had some major advances in organ preservation and treatment. So some of the examples include, for example, some of the liver transplant perfusion devices, which have gone up, and lung and heart has also been using different perfusion devices. So in terms of liver, there's both normothermic and hypothermic perfusion devices. There's 2 normothermic perfusion devices on the market, and some hypothermic oxygenation perfusion devices are going to probably be FDA approved soon, and there are 2 that are being developed or are being developed. These are some of the normothermic perfusion devices. The Transmedics device is a very nice device. It costs a hell of a lot, though, so unfortunately for the CFO, they may see a decrease in the contribution margin every time we use one of these, but there's no question that this helps outcomes, especially when you use DCD organs. So there's no doubt we have amazingly improved outcomes using these devices. The DCD donors are now almost equivalent to brain dead donors in terms of outcome. Using steatotic and older livers seem to be, again, facilitated by using these perfusion devices. You can perfuse them for a while. You can do it 12, 24 hours and put a liver in and maybe not have 3 o'clock in the morning be our block time, which it sort of is still a little bit. Less early allograft dysfunction. There's no question when you unclamp one of these livers, it starts working right away. It doesn't really take a while. You don't get the hemodynamic instability and less ischemic cholangiopathy, which used to be a real problem with our DCD organs. But it does cost a lot. What's been going on in the United States? If you look at the proportion of recovered organs undergoing machine perfusion, it's gone up significantly over the last few years. So if you look at kidney, if you look at the total number of kidneys that are perfused, you can see that, but the bulk of DCD organs are being perfused. Same with liver. Over half the DCDs, and probably more now, are being perfused. Yes, there are DCD heart transplants going on. They use some form of perfusion. So these are the proportion of kidneys that are being perfused. You can see that DCDs were already high, and brain dead donors is going up. Liver, the number of DCD organs that are being perfused is going up astronomically, exponentially. And again, this will add to the cost of transplant, but more and more of the DCDs are getting used. Heart transplant is sort of up and down. They've used different machine perfusion devices. Same with lung. But there's also a different way of using procuring DCDs, and that's called normothermic renal perfusion. I'll get into the controversies of that in just a second. But this is, again, in the state of a DCD, the circulatory death, after it's declared after withdrawal support, the DCD is cannulated, and sort of either cardiopulmonary bypass circuit or ECMO circuit or equivalent is actually started after the donor's been died, and in situ, really, the organs are being reperfused and reanimated. The cerebral blood vessels are either divided or clamped to make sure we don't reperfuse the brain. That would be against the wishes of a withdrawal support patient to be not resuscitated, but the organs are resuscitated. So in the thoracic and abdominal organs, when it's TA-NRP, the heart is reanimated. In abdominal, the cross clamp is at the abdomen, so the heart doesn't get stopped. That's abdominal SRP. Why do you do this, though? Well, it really reduces a warm ischemia time on a DCD donor, and there's certainly much less organ injury than just standard excision and standard cold storage. There's no question that this way of procuring DCD organs is far superior to static cold storage and rapid procurement. It actually allows for the assessment of the organ function while on the ECMO circuit because, in fact, the liver starts clearing acid, lactate levels go down, you can watch the heart function. There's no question, 100%, we have superior transplant outcomes when we use DCD undergoing NRP or not. And therefore, we have increased organ utilization. And the truth is, we're way behind other countries. In Europe, this is the standard way that all DCDs are performed in many European countries. All right, now, there have been some ethical challenges. I'll get back to that notion in a second. With the technique, it's actually less probably ethically challenged when we don't reanimate the heart when there's abdominal NRP. In abdominal NRP, the patient has been declared cardiac death. There's a waiting time that's passed. The abdominal organs are then perfused using the ECMO circuit with an aortic cross clamp that limits the oxygenated blood to perfuse only the abdominal organs. And then the organs are assessed and then procured. Now, in thoracoabdominal NRP, the heart and lungs are actually perfused, and cerebral blood vessels are either ligated or divided to prevent resuscitation of the brain, as the thoracic abdominal organs are reanimated or reperfused using the circuit. I'm going to get into some of the controversies of both DCD and NRP towards the end, because I do want to address some of the stuff that's been out there in the lay literature. Other surgical developments, well, just like every other part of surgery, robotics has invaded our system, and now we're doing stuff minimally invasively, things that I thought we would never achieve. Actually, Dr. Oben's not here because he's performing a robot donor nephrectomy. He started at 5 a.m., so he's excused, I guess. He's generating some RVUs. But we're doing a lot of the country is doing donor nephrectomy robotically now. A lot of centers are actually doing the kidney transplant implants robotically. With robotic surgery. Robotic donor hepatectomy is actually getting a lot of traction. And finally, a few centers, including a fair number in Saudi Arabia and some in the United States, have done the liver transplant actually in robotic assisted fashion, which, I can't imagine just a few years ago we'd even think about doing a liver transplant robotic. What else are some of the cool advances that we're having? We talked about long-term organ preservation on our machine. Well, there are other advances that are happening. There are some preservation techniques that allow an organ to be put down not only for 24 hours, 36 hours, but for several days or up to even 100 days. Some companies have developed these peptoids that are based on natural antifreeze proteins found in Arctic fish. Those Arctic fish swim around at sub-zero temperatures, and they have these natural antifreeze proteins. The preclinical work said that if you use these proteins to perfuse organs, you can put organs down at sub-zero temperatures and not have ice crystals form. and then reanimate them days to even weeks later. And they have shown that in preclinical trials. Another way of thinking about how to prevent ice formation is a technique called vitrification. And both in the cooling and in the rewarming stages, you want to try to figure out how to avoid ice crystals. And this was a Nature paper. Actually, Eric Finger is the senior author. He was one of my former fellows. But this is a Nature paper that really looked into the feasibility of keeping these organs at sub-zero temperatures and avoiding crystals and using nanoparticles to rewarm an organ completely very rapidly, avoiding any ice crystal formation. A lot of crystals actually form during the rewarming period. So they put down at least rat kidneys down for 100 days. And then after 100 days, rewarm them rapidly, sewed them in, and they work. And that would prevent me from having 2 a.m. as my block time for, and I could say, oh, I'll use that kidney. I'll do that next week sometime. That would be revolutionary for it. All right, what about xenotransplants? You've heard a lot in the press about xenotransplants. We've had a long history of trying to use animal organs, including Keith Reesma, this crazy CT surgeon that put chimpanzee kidneys into humans in the early 1970s, actually. And you know about baby Faye, and you know more recently about genetically modified pigs. We've used kidneys and hearts. Long-term success is still a bit evasive, but we are getting there. And there's also this other ethical challenge. Which patients should we actually consider as good candidates for clinical trials and xenotransplantation? So the proof of concept in the modern xenograft era is that there have been several groups that use brain-dead humans. They were declared brain-dead, and their hearts and lungs are still working. And they've used some of these brain-dead folks to sew in some of these xenograft kidneys. We learned a lot to using this model. In China, they've done a lung transplant this way. In the United States, transplant surgeons at UAB and other places, NYU, use deceased deceased human beings, brain-dead human beings that have heart and lungs going, and they sewed in these xenografts into these brain-dead patients, and they studied some of the immunologic and other issues that they faced when you use a pig xenograft. Now, xenotransplant itself is really challenging because not only because of a lot of preformed antibodies we have against these organs with the danger of hyperacute rejection, but we also still face acute cellular, acute mediated rejection. Now, the pig donors that have been used clinically in the United States have been these gene-edited porcine models. So there are different gene editing pigs. The first ones were only single gene edited. They were added, for example, human genes that would inactivate the complement system. The ones that you've heard about being used at Mass General, et cetera, in general come from either Revivicor, United Therapeutics, which have approximately 10 gene edits. And the same with a pig heart that was done in University of Maryland. What are the gene edits that they've used? Well, there are several transgenes that are inserted into the porcine genome to inactivate human complement and some immunomodulatory genes. Like decay accelerating factor is a factor that inactivates human complement. Unfortunately, the DAF equivalent of pigs do not inactivate human complement, so they had to be inserted as a transgene. In addition, there are a lot of carbohydrate antigens that are present in pigs that we all have antibodies against, so those were deleted as well. So there's gene deletions, knockouts, there's gene inserts, knock-ins, and we want to make sure that they don't express any blood group antigens that can be recognized as well, so those are deleted as well. There's another set of genes also, especially to inactivate endogenous retroviruses that pigs carry, and to inactivate PERV, so knockout of pig glycan antigen genes. Again, eGenesis has a lot of gene edits, but 59 of them were actually specific to inactivate endogenous retroviruses. So genetically modified pigs, a 10 gene one, elimination of 3 genes to decrease immunogenicity, addition of 7 genes to reduce inflammation, and deactivation of endogenous retroviruses. And here's an article in one of Nature, amazing feat. U.S. man alive 6 months after pig kidney transplant. But rejection still remains an issue despite all these genetic modifications. Even with knocking out porcine genes and knocking in human genes, rejection seems to still be a problem, as are zoonoses. So what are the most recent results of human xenotransplant in the United States? Well, we had a pig kidney put in. It functioned 4 months and was lost after 130 days. One pig kidney recipient is still going after 6 months. Another was more recently transplanted. 2 pig hearts have been done. One lasted only a few weeks and another lasted 2 months. This is not rousing success, especially compared to what we would get from a human organ. So who do we actually get to receive these organs? This is a real question and a bit of an ethical quandary. If they're candidates for a pig kidney transplant, why were they not candidates for a human transplant? Maybe we can get back to that question. What about other sources of organs? Well, there are some promising things that have been coming aboard in the last several years. Either human or discarded human organs or animal organs can be decellularized. So one uses detergents and other solvents to get rid of all the cells and then leave behind a scaffold that are repopulated with stem cells. Cellular transplantation continues to move forward, especially in islet cell transplants where you can derive islets from stem cells. And there are some artificial organs being developed, and hopefully we'll see the light of day soon. So what's going on with organs that are decellularized? Well, once you remove all living cells using detergents and enzymes, you're left behind. What you are left behind is the extracellular matrix and the scaffolding, and then they can be repopulated and seeding with stem cells. For example, you can think about getting inducible pluripotent stem cells from the same recipient. So if you got stem cells from the candidate, there now no longer would be an immunologic barrier because you're using the candidate to repopulate these organs. So if you were to do this, we'd get over the notion that there'd be any rejection. Of course, you couldn't use this in someone who has a genetic issue that led to the organ transplant itself. But what's the status of this? Well, there actually has been fairly interesting successful small animal models where hearts were decellularized and repopulated with heart cells. And you can see little pictures of the little rat heart beating away. Lungs have been created with the ability to exchange gases. But the problem is that you need so many different cell types to reorient themselves and to repopulate, and they have to differentiate in the exactly right way. They have to have the right topology and the right microcirculation, the orientation to recapitulate organ function. So if you think about the multiple cell types that are present in a kidney or in a liver, it's a huge challenge. You need billions and billions of these cells that differentiate into all sorts of multiple cell types. One of the other challenges is how do you recellularize the vascular supply? How do you get endothelial cells to coat the blood vessel scaffolding that you have left when you have these decellularized organs? Now, things that are not really just sort of conduits or storage things have been used. So decellularized trachea and bladder have been used in human trials. So what about artificial organs and mechanical things? Well, the total artificial heart has been used for a while, but the only, again, I'm not a content expert. I have Jay Powell in the audience to correct me if I'm wrong, but currently, really, as of the current state, it's primarily used as a bridge to transplant, as is other devices such as LVADs, et cetera. So the total artificial heart, at least not right now, is not used as a replacement for human transplant. These artificial organs have a very high bar. In other words, the long-term success of human organ transplant is measured in decades, not in months or years. So to get to a point where they could replace human organ transplant, the artificial organs have a long way to go. They need long-term reliability and function. So you think about something that's mechanical that might break down over a year or two. That's not gonna work for us. What about an implantable artificial kidney? Yeah, there's been actually this kidney project. UCSF was one of the institutions that have been working on this for a while. So there is an implantable, almost dialysis-like machine that you can implant into the iliacs. They've worked on coating the conduits in and out from the iliac artery and vein to make sure they don't get thrombosis. And it's driven by the patient's systemic blood pressure, not a mechanical pump or anything. So there's no pump to fail. They also line the dialysis membrane with renal cells to make sure that there's actually some metabolic function. And so the current status of the artificial kidney is that it's actually in preclinical animal trials. They are being sown into large animals. They do make urine. They do clear the toxins. They don't do all the metabolic things that a kidney does. Like you still have to give erythropoietin. You still have to give some hormones. And there's no human clinical trials just yet. Again, the artificial kidney is a cassette about this big. It combines both a hemofilter and a bioreactor with renal cells. Large animal trials in pigs and others have been actually quite promising. But human trials may be around the corner in 4 to 5 years. Why would we want that? Well, again, I would see this as a bridge to transplantation for patients that may have to wait a long term on dialysis. Having an implantable dialysis or wearable dialysis is probably better than doing regular dialysis, even at home. Yeah. All right, what are some of the ethical challenges and headwinds that we've talked about? NRP, the novel way to perform DCD, has been opposed by some physician groups. There's been a public misunderstanding of the role of transplant professionals in withdrawal of life support and DCD organ procurement. What about living donor transplants? Well, we want to try to get rid of at least financial disincentives, but does that really compete with the notion that we don't want to pay donors to donate? So lots of headwinds, lots of media attention, almost too much attention from Congress. So the transplant system reports to the SEC-HHS, and it actually has two main regulatory agencies that it reports to, both HRSA and CMS. But also the FDA regulates all the clinical trials and all the meds. The CDC tells us that we can't transplant organs without telling every single patient that they might get some disease. NIH funding has gone down for all sorts of research. And then unfortunately, Congress has gotten too involved, I would say. The Senate Finance Committee, the House Energy and Commerce Committees have had these hearings, I guess, where interested parties and parties with agendas have gone up and said essentially how terrible the U.S. transplant system is. We don't get anywhere or see anything unless we stand on the shoulder of giants. Thomas Marchioro was the third ASTS president and gave this as part of his 1977 address. He said during his presidential address, 1977, "Unfortunately, as always in the history of mankind, we, like everyone else, face an uncertain future. In the past few years, the number and variety of apocalyptic books, editorials, and speeches has increased beyond all bounds, so much so that they have lost all power to shock, amaze, titillate, or stimulate. All they do is confused." I think that might apply today just as much as it did apply in 1977. So what are some of the recent press that I'm talking about? Well, the New York Times, in their investigative reporting, has talked about donors that were prepared to remove their organs and then they woke up, and they claim that a push for more organ transplants is putting donors at risk. If you read some of these articles and what they purport to report, though, it's interesting how some of these have to do with more of the withdrawal of support decision and what happens after withdrawal of support happens, as opposed to the organ donation system itself. And just remember that organ donation is an altruistic act based on trust of the medical system. If we lose public trust, transplantation itself may collapse. Public trust is actually absolutely essential for the success of transplantation, including living donors and deceased donors. And there are so many forces that are eroding public trust right now, including a lot of medical misinformation, the use of anecdote and hyperbole to advance agendas, and scientific evidence and data are truly being devalued in many leaders in our government. So just remember what donation after cardiac death is. Now, the decision to withdraw life support is a decision made solely by the patient and the family in conjunction with the treating physician and providers. And the expected outcome of withdrawal life support is death. But it has to be emphasized that no transplant team, nor any OPO is involved in this decision, in this difficult decision of a family to withdraw. And in general, if a patient doesn't pass away within 120 minutes of withdrawal of life support, transplant team and the OPO often just back off, shut down the organ donation process, and we're done with it. It's hard to predict who among all the patients that undergo withdrawal life support is going to pass right away, or may just hang on for a while, or maybe even in remarkable circumstances, quote unquote, wake up. That doesn't really have to do with the organ donation system. It has to do with just withdrawal life support and the notion that we have to have very consistent methods and the way we discuss this with patients and their families. Once the decision of withdrawal life support is made, however, referral to the OPO is made so that if the patient wanted to in life donate their organs, or the family wishes to have withdrawal of life support performed in a fashion that facilitates organ procurement, then the OPO goes on site and then makes logistical plans and proceed with organ plate allocation and stands by while the withdrawal of life support is performed, perhaps in a location closer to the operating room so we can facilitate organ donation to respect the autonomy of the patient and the patient's families. The withdrawal of life support is supervised by the treating team, not by OPO staff, not by any transplant surgeons. The donor teams are on site just to facilitate organ donation so that we can do it as soon as death is declared. And once death is declared, there's always a set time, waiting time that elapses to try to minimize autoresuscitation. Normothermic regional perfusion, again, sometimes controversial way of doing the organ perfusion. The American College of Physicians came out with a statement that they actually had grave concerns about the ethical boundaries that we may be crossed when we do NRP. They stated that a proposed method of organ retrieval that uses what has been called normothermic regional perfusion with controlled donation after DCD raises ethical questions and concerns. And they said in their statement, donors cannot be made dead in order to obtain their organs, and organ retrieval cannot cause death. Well, I take issue with this statement. We are not making donors dead just to retrieve their organs. That, again, that decision is made before organ donation is reached and independently of decisions regarding organ donation. Now, the manner in which the withdrawal of support and the timing and setting is influenced to facilitate the donor and donor family wishes to donate life-saving organs in order to maximally utilize the organs. They're not made dead by the DCD organ procurement process. They also say that we're resuscitating the patient. The truth is we're resuscitating the organs. I know that sounds like semantics, but we are making sure that the brain is not resuscitated. In other words, we're not violating the patient's wishes to be DNR and to withdraw life support. The patient is not resuscitated, but some set of the organs in situ are in fact reanimated. We're not causing brain death. We want to make sure that there's no restoration of brain blood flow if we're using the cadaveric body as the vessel in which to reanimate the organs. So the concerns that this method of organ procurement violates ethical principles, I would say let's look at the ethical principles we're trying to follow, particularly autonomy. So if you look at the autonomy of the patient that has decided pre-death to be an organ donor, they've already made a decision to withdraw life. The expected outcome is death. The desired outcome is actually death with dignity and death without unnecessary suffering. And again, the desired outcome for those who have expressed this is actually successful organ donation. That is something good, the only good thing actually that comes out of something tragic. And as the last act of the decedent, a gift is made to society and other human beings. And the patient in a real practical sense lives on in others. That respects autonomy of that patient. Other things in the press, allocation out of sequence. New York Times headline, organ transplant system in chaos as waiting lists are ignored. Sick and skipped over, how we investigated the organ transplant system. What are they talking about? They're talking about a thing called allocation out of sequence. Now, we have a match run with every single organ. That sequences all the patients that were supposed to go down when there's an organ offer, and they always go down the match run 100% of the time. Now, are there times when you have a late center decline or a really difficult to place organ that every single center is pretty much declining? Yes, that happens. Now, rather than have that organ not be used, the OPO actually have used bypass codes to say, okay, we're going into expedited placement. We're going to place that organ in a place that will accept that organ. And that's called allocation out of sequence. Now, admittedly, there have been 56 different ways that have been done. So we need to make this much more consistent and really talk about which organs are the really hard to place organs. There needs to be a universal definition of this. Right now, it's been a little bit haphazard. In other words, OPO executive might have the speed dial of someone down at Mayo Clinic, Arizona that knows that they'll take them. That's not really the best way to place an organ fairly, but they have done it in the spirit of trying to use every single organ. So I would suggest that allocation out of sequence needs to be made more consistent, but it is not reflective of a quote unquote system in chaos. I close to you with a couple thoughts. Tom Starzl, who was the inaugural president of the ASTS, in his address, 1975, he said, "We conduct our affairs these days in a cynical social climate, leavened by occasional ennobling acts of which organ donation is a prototype. If it became perceived or imagined by the public that hypocrisy and greed were central to our transplantation programs, cadaveric donors would become unavailable and all the other punitive side effects that you can easily imagine would follow. Ours, in other words, transplantation, is a medical specialty most founded on public trust and personal altruism. The corollary is that it's the most fragile." So the future of transplantation remains quite challenging. We want to continue to improve our organ allocation distribution in iterative and incremental fashion to increase equity and access. We need to always balance competing interests. We always need to try to increase organ donation. We still need living donation to supplement this. Animal sources, artificial organs, I think eventually may help with the acute organ shortage. Not right now, not tomorrow. But transplantation, if you think about it, it can represent a bright future, the treatment of patients with end-stage organ failure. So I should have started with this by thanking everybody and thanking my entire surgical team, all the administrators and medical colleagues. Without our medical colleagues, we'd be nowhere. So not only our transplant nephrology team, our transplant hepatology team, the lung transplant and heart transplant teams with their support. But if you think about how many people it takes to actually get a transplant done, a single transplant is about 120 individuals. All the OR staff, the transplant anesthesia, the APPs, the nurse coordinators, the ICU folks, transplant ID, cardiology, radiology. We depend on IR and CT and ultrasound to bail us out. We are mandated to have nutritionists and pharmacists, mandated by CMS, to evaluate every single one of our patients, social workers, financial counselors, the entire organ procurement organization system. Yes, UNOS, which used to be a four-letter word, UNOS actually helped us get the system that we're in. The SRTR is an incredible organization that helps maintain transparency and holds us accountable. But especially I wanted to thank all of our patients who put their trust in us, and particularly our donors and donor families who selflessly give of themselves to make sure that transplantation actually exists. So I'll pause there and happy to take any questions.
We only have time for about one question. We only have about 2 minutes, but if anybody sends anything on the chat, I'll be happy to forward. And
yeah, I'm going to ask the first question. So probably the only question. So first, Dr. Hirose, thank you. This is a spectacular tour through the politics and legislation and evolution of transplant. Can you go back to the slide just on Dr. Marchiero? Because I wanted to make a historical point that is important, that probably myself, and I noticed that Hugh Foy is on Zoom, that only Hugh Foy and I know that Dr. Marchiero was faculty member at the University of Washington. In fact, was my first partner as a junior faculty member when I came to the University of Washington. And his portrait is up in our transplant offices as well. So I wanted everyone to recognize Dr. Marchiero. He is a landmark hero in transplantation, and his whole career was here at the University of Washington. I was going to ask a complicated question about regional perfusion. You actually covered it really well, but I guess I'll get to the definition of cardiac death and the aspect of reanimation and how we navigate that fragile ethical boundary of kind of what the definitions are that we use for cardiac death, and how, how we help individuals to understand the difference between rebirth or reanimation, which you describe, but I think is a part of the challenge of DCD and regional perfusion.
I think that's a great question. I think the problem is with the terminology of cardiac death. Cardiac death doesn't mean all your myocytes are dead, that the heart is dead. In fact, it means that the patient is dead because the heart and lungs have stopped. That means if you did nothing at that point and let nature take its place, the brain would die within 4 minutes. We wait 5 minutes after the heart has stopped to make sure there's some waiting period to, number one, make sure there's not auto-resuscitation, but two, the reason why we don't perfuse the brain again is that technically, could there be a couple neurons or more than a couple neurons left that are alive at that moment? There could be. And we do not want to violate the principle of autonomy in that we don't want to resuscitate the patient's existence. I think everyone would agree that you are dead once your brain is dead. No matter what your lungs or heart, if your lungs are being supported by a ventilator, if your heart is restarted somehow, if your liver is still working, then not all the hepatocytes are dead. So I think the notion of death is that you get to a point where your heart and lungs are no longer working, no longer supported. We wait a certain amount, and then we can resuscitate those organs. Like we can take them out of the body and put them in a box and have that heart start working and beating again if you perfuse it with warm blood again. So you can take it out of the body, put it into a box, and I would argue that that patient still dead is still in a box with a heart doing this. It happens that we do that in situ. And so the definition of death, I still think, is that the brain is dead. So your soul or your existence, which we all agree is sort of resides in the brain, is no longer functioning. That's how I look at it, because it is sort of, if you think about it, it defies the notion that there's irreversible cardiac damage. We don't want irreversible cardiac damage. We want to be able to use that heart if indeed the patient is dead, but we want to be able to reanimate it. And it's really the location of the resuscitation of the heart that is different in NRP as opposed to a machine in a box. It's happening using the body as a vessel, and that part of the body is being resuscitated, but it's not irreversible damage to the heart that it can't be resuscitated. And I'm sorry, I was remiss to not only mention that Dr. Mark Yoro was the first chief of transplant here at University of Washington. He was there at Starzl's side in Colorado when he first started doing liver transplants. So he was literally Starzl's right-hand person. There's a reason why he's the third ASTS president in the entire thing. It was Tom, then it was Fred Belzer, then it was Tom. So I failed to acknowledge his importance, especially in the UW. That's why I chose his quote, actually, because he is a prominent member of the UW faculty. So thank you very much.